Well, welcome everyone to this National Association of Scholars webinar series on American innovation. Normally our host is David Randall, but he's off today and I'm your host. I'm Scott Turner. I normally run the NAS's webinar series on restoring the sciences, but since David couldn't be here today, I've stepped in and I'll be the moderator for today's event. What we're going to be talking about today, we're going to be talking to two very interesting people. One is Nick Taylor, who you see on the upper left of your screen, and the other is Jeff Hecht, who is down on the bottom left of your screen. They're both interested in, well, they both have different things to say about laser light, and this is the topic of today's webinar, harnessing light, the laser. So I'm going to introduce the speakers. Jeff Hecht is a prolific writer on science and technology. He's written a lot of interesting books on the history of lasers and the invention and some of the controversy that surrounded that. And then Nick Taylor is also a very prolific author, and he has not only an interest in lasers, but also some interest in bass fishing, the mafia crime families, and life in a small church. And from 2002 to 2006, Nick Taylor served as president of the Authors Guild, which is the oldest and largest organization of published writers in the United States. Before we begin, please let me encourage you to put your questions in. We like lots of questions. Please put them in the Q&A box. If you inadvertently put them in chat, that's no problem, but we do like them to be in Q&A. And we try to get to every question, but if we can't get to every question today, please send them to David Randall at Randall with two L's at nas.org, and we'll try to answer them personally. So Jeff and Nick, welcome to Harnessing Light, American Innovation, and let's get started. So Nick, why don't you tell us something about your background and some of the things that you have found and some of the interesting topics of the invention of the laser that you've been exploring.
Well, Scott, the first thing you introduced me correctly as a jack of all trades author. And I came upon the story of Gould and the invention of the laser when I had proposed an entirely different book to a publisher at Simon & Schuster. But it turns out this was a much better story because Gould not only coined the word laser, light amplification by stimulated emission of radiation. He drew the first diagram of how the laser should work and described some of its uses. And that goes back to 1957. Excuse me. But before that, Charles Towns was he proved with an invention that he called the maser, microwave amplification by stimulated emission of radiation, that electrons and atoms, molecules that gave off their radiation, those things could be stimulated to emit their radiation. And he proved that with the maser. The maser, which he had this flash of light sitting on a park bench in Washington, D.C. in 1951. And in 1954, the maser came to be. And the maser was an interesting sort of invention that could be used primarily in spectroscopy. It was good for making silent and very accurate amplifiers in terms of radio, made great atomic clocks, but mostly the news that greeted the invention of the laser, including a front page piece in the Wall Street Journal, was the proof of Einstein's prediction in 1915 that radiation could be, that atoms and molecules could be stimulated to give off their radiation. So Gould did, Towns did this in 1954, the maser came to be. Charles Towns was still alive when I was writing my book, Laser, the Inventor, the Nobel Laureate in the 30-Year Patent War. And when I interviewed him out in California at Caltech, the first thing he said to me was, "How much do you know about physics?" And I said, "Dr. Towns, to be honest with you, I don't know a lot about physics, but I know what a lawyer can explain to a jury about the laser and then the patent warfare that followed." And the truth is that when I started writing my book, I got these things. It's like a video, An Idiot's Guide to Physics. So Jeff's going to be able to fill in a lot of the details about how lasers actually work. But in my research, I started with Towns, and then Gordon Gould, who I interviewed quite a bit, and who's also a very good teacher. Gordon Gould was a student. His father was the editor of Scholastic Magazine. They lived in New York, upstate. And he was a graduate student at Columbia when Charles Towns was a professor there. This was before Towns had won his Nobel Prize, which he shared with a couple of Russians in the area of amplification of media. And Gould had gotten a master's in physics at Union College in New York. And he just had this, Gould was a theoretical physicist, and Gordon Gould was a practical laboratory-oriented physicist. He could intuit things once he was in the lab. And he wanted to move, as did Towns, but Gould wanted to harness light waves as opposed to microwaves. They're much shorter, they're much stronger, and ultimately more powerful. And Gould started thinking about this, and he had another physics experiment, thesis experiment, that he'd been given at Columbia by his physics professor. And Polycarp Cush was his name, and another Nobel Prize winner eventually. And Gould wasn't working so much on his thesis experiment, but he wanted to deal with light waves. And he was married at the time, and he woke up one night in November of 1957, and he had an idea of what he could do. And he got up and wrote he coined the term laser, light amplification by stimulated emission of radiation, which I mentioned before. And he drew a diagram of a tube with optically flat mirrors, partially transparent on each end or on one end. And he described how a coherent beam could be formed. And the element inside, and he had the idea of thallium vapor, and he would do it with optical amplification, a light outside the tube that he was talking about. Well, that he wrote for several days. He took his notebook, 9 pages, and he took him to a candy store in the Bronx, where he was living at the time with his wife Ruth, and he had all the pages stamped. And he made one mistake. Getting the stamp on his notebook was a good thing, but what he believed incorrectly, and what Gould wanted was to be an inventor of a significant invention or inventions, much like Thomas Edison. But he believed you had to build the device he was describing before he could get a patent on it. And ultimately, he went to work at a company called TRG here in New York, try to build a laser. Working for TRG, Gould wrote a proposal to the Defense Department. He thought maybe TRG, they thought they could get $300,000 from the Defense Department to try to build this device. Well, the Defense Department turned around and gave him $1 million because some of the uses that Gould had described, heating materials to very high temperatures, causing chemical reactions, distance measuring, all of these things are things that lasers do, but that Gould conceived they could do before a laser actually existed. The first laser, as everybody knows, or everybody knows about laser history knows, was built by Theodore Maiman in 1960, I believe it was. And it was a ruby rod. Arthur Shallow, who was Robert Towns' brother-in-law, had dismissed mercury as a lasing medium, but Maiman thought it would work, and it did work. And the first working laser was built by Theodore Maiman, and it was so small. It was like the size of a cigarette that the company he worked for had to do something larger so that when the publicity arrived, as indeed it did, of this laser, it looked too small. The cigarette-sized ruby rod was just too small, so they wanted to make it look bigger so it would look more important. And so that's how the laser got invented. Gould's here in New York, some of the first experiments were performed with using lasers in eye surgery. And that was a very early indication of just how vastly ubiquitous lasers have become in everything we know. The coherent light beams can read information, and optical fibers came along. It's impossible to conceive of the world that we live in today without the use of lasers. Just like it's impossible to imagine our world without the digital devices that we use constantly today. Lasers make those possible. And so that's the story of the invention of the laser. Now, Gould's story is enhanced even more, not enhanced, but he couldn't build a laser because he was a kind of a radical guy here in New York. And so he had joined the 6th Avenue Club in the Village where he lived with his girlfriend at the time, who was a little bit more, he was a liberal kind of guy, and she was more liberal. But he liked sexy women, and he liked her, and she was pretty open to it all. And they had met working on the Manhattan Project, where they were doing a testing, a contraption that was to mimic the testing of the what was built later in Tennessee, to create, to refine bomb-grade uranium. But anyway, long story short, the 6th Avenue Club was communist-related, the American Communist Party. And so once TRG, Gould's company, had gotten this $1 million contract from the Defense Department, it turned out that Gould, because of his previous associations with the 6th Avenue clubs, the communist related club, he couldn't get a security clearance. And therefore, when TRG was trying to build a laser, Gould couldn't work on it.
Hmm.
The experimenters in the laboratory could come out and tell him what they needed to know, but they couldn't tell him what they were actually doing.
Hmm.
And so Gould never built a laser before Theodore Maiman did. And that all went into the arguments that were made over 30 years as Gould was trying to get basic laser patents, a use patent, an amplifier patent, an oscillator patent, and something called the Q switch. So the laser, long story short, is two inventions. It's an amplifier, which lights the medium inside the tube to excite the molecules and electrons that are given off, that can then be stimulated to create this coherent beam that bounces back and forth between the mirrors. And it's the oscillator is the other part of that invention, amplifier and oscillator. So the laser is actually two inventions.
Oh, okay. That was fascinating. I mean, that was a very illuminating historical sketch of it. I think we're going to probably come back to this 30-year patent war that you talk about. But Jeff, why don't you tell us how lasers actually work, as Nick introduced you?
Well, I came into the laser business. Actually, I was at Caltech as an undergraduate in engineering, and I was happened to didn't want to go back home to New Jersey for the summer and after my junior year, so I managed to get a job in my advisor's lab, and my advisor was working on holography. So I worked with holography. Didn't get enchanted with it as many other people did, but having that background, when I was kicking around a few years later, I ended up getting a job running working on a laser magazine. So I've got involved much more in the practical side, as you would expect from a degree in engineering. And by the time I got into the laser business, one of the things that people were always talking about was saying the laser is a solution looking for a problem, and that was partly a joke, and what it really reflected was that this wonderful new invention that had gotten the front page of the New York Times, it got into Scientific American in a big way, and also all sorts of discussions. It was not selling very much, and the people who'd started companies, and such as Theodore Maiman, who had went out soon after inventing the laser and started a company called Corad, and they had plans to sell lots of lasers. Well, they didn't really sell very many lasers. And what can you do with a laser? Well, what you can do with a laser is using this coherent light, because all the light waves are they're all waves marching in step, up and down and up and down, and they're all aligned together, and they're all the same wavelength. And this can let you control the light much better. Among other things, it lets you, as Gould had shown, you put mirrors on opposite ends of a tube, reflecting back and forth far more evenly than my hands would, and you can make a beam. And this was one of Gould's other, key realizations, that you could create a tightly focused beam from using the coherent light. And with that, when once Maiman showed what the laser could do, and Maiman himself demonstrated something new as well. Maiman showed that the laser could be operated pulsed, where the original idea was just to have it emitting constantly. So you could concentrate the pulse of lasers into a little pulse, and you focus the beam, and then you have a big bright spot, and then you could drill a hole through something. You could drill a hole through, one of the first things they did was diamond, because diamond's very hard, but the energy from the laser pulse would ablate the diamond. So that, led to some applications. Now, what you had when, we started, when after Maiman's discovery of the ruby laser and demonstration of the ruby laser, what he was doing was actually using what he had learned for his doctoral dissertation that never got finished. You could excite the laser by using light from another source to illuminate it.
Yeah.
And Maiman had used, pulsed light to get high intensity. So other people started doing this right after. In fact, they duplicated, I think it was TRG duplicated Maiman's laser within a few weeks. And soon other people started using other materials that emitted other wavelengths. There was a group at IBM that had done uranium, a laser with uranium in a crystal, then the uranium emitted light, and it would give you different wavelengths. And Elias Snitzer at American Optical Company put neodymium ions into a glass fiber, an optical fiber, and then put a flash lamp around it and generated pulses out of that. So that was one of many type of different laser demonstrations, and many of these would have later have more important turn out to be quite important. The fiber laser, for example, has become very important in fields from amplifying light in the fiber optic systems. I mean, this is how you're seeing me and listening to me is light going through fiber optics all the way from outside of my house all the way to you, or much of the way to you. And also, you could make these fiber lasers larger, and you could use them for cutting and welding and things like that. Yeah. So there were other lasers in this first round of lasers in the early 1960s. There also were gas lasers, helium neon lasers. They were long tubes that emitted red light mostly, because that was the light that was the first lasers that people could see the light from, that and the ruby. But the helium neon lasers were used widely for demonstrations. And there were semiconductor lasers demonstrated, and those have also turned out to be very, very important. And none of these individual types of lasers at first were very practical, but they could be improved. So Bell Labs wanted to make, was very interested in fiber optics, and so was Charles Cow in England, who actually proposed the whole idea of fiber optic communications, because everybody else had thought that nobody could see through glass that far, but Corning developed very clear glass. And then the problem was they wanted to use diode lasers, which fit very nicely with a communications electronics, but with the first diode lasers, they had to be operated at cryogenic temperatures, and they would only last for seconds. So it was not until the mid 1970s that you could get diode lasers that would last much longer. And that was, Bell Labs managed to do that years and years, and millions of dollars they spent making diode lasers that would last long enough to be used in communications. And then we started, by this point, having other applications of lasers. There were medical applications, as Nick said, and there were quite a range of them. There have been quite a range developed since. They started out with dermatology, trying to eliminate discolored areas of the skin, and later on to remove tattoos that turned out to be, one of those things that seemed like a good idea.
Tattoos of early girlfriends.
Yes.
Right.
And you had spectroscopy, you had holography, you had a lot of technique, this whole ranges of things. If if you used, remember, compact discs, that's a laser technology. And laser printers, and I've seen little guy coming out to look at the gutters of my house. He's measures them by putting a little laser pointer up and measuring the distance to up to the roof.
Exactly. And one of the first moon missions put a reflector on the moon to accurately measure the shoot a coherent beam up to the moon. It stays so tightly focused for all that distance, however many millions of miles that is, and get the first accurate measure of the distance from the Earth to the moon.
Yeah, I talked with the guy who's was down on the ground doing it, and it's just amazing, and it was an amazing thing to him. He's still around. He and Buzz Aldrin, I think, are the last of that crew.
Yeah.
There were lasers up in the Gemini capsules that were experimented with.
Yeah. And there was even an episode of Big Bang Theory that talked about that. So one of the guys was trying to impress a girl with a rooftop laser, actually measuring the distance for her. Anyway, but yeah, this all these amazing applications of lasers sort of undercuts this joke of a solution looking for a problem, because what an amazing number of problems it found to be able to address.
Yeah, what it really shows, I think, was that one of the values of the lasers was that it could be customized to make you use one kind of laser to do one particular thing, and use a laser emitting at another wavelength with another material to do something else. So if you have what's called a fiber laser now, the laser that starts out with diode lasers that are pumped with electric power goes into them. They turns it into light, and they can turn about half or more of the electric power into light, and then that light can be turned in the fiber laser into a different wavelength and to a much narrower beam. So you could do things like cut sheets of steel.
Amazing. Yeah, amazing. So just to the title of this series is American Innovation, and the kinds of things that you were talking about that went into the invention of the laser. If you read the history of the invention of the transistor, it's actually a very similar kind of a thing. It's you have someone who thinks about a problem in a different way, doggedly sticks to it, and of course the transistor was very much an American innovation, as it seems the laser was. So is it fair to say that the invention of laser was an example of American innovation, and if so, what made it that way?
Well, as I said earlier, Towns shared the Nobel Prize in physics with two Russians. So the kinds of thinking about light amplification, or wave amplification at least, was being thought of in Russia. But the commercialization, as Jeff has pointed out, of the laser and its many, many, many uses, most of which could never have been conceived when the laser first began to work, is certainly an American innovation.
Yeah, I think that the Russians just early on did not have much they didn't have much supporting technology, really, and they couldn't do much. They did have some ideas, but they didn't get very far. I mean, if you look, actually, there were two people who made the key invention that allowed semiconductor lasers to emit, at longer periods of time. Essentially, was a key point in the invention, and one of them was Herbert Kramer, who was working at Varian at the time, and his management just shrugged him off. He didn't support him at all. He got the Nobel Prize, and he shared it with Zores Alferov in Russia, and Alferov was able to, had more support from his management, which was at a Russian institution. But that was early on. That was probably the biggest contribution from Russia, and by the time you got, that was 10 years into the history of the laser. A lot of the initial work was done in the U.S. and that dispersed. And then later on, there was actually the development of the high power fiber laser, which was done by a company called IPG Photonics, which was founded in Russia by a former Russian a Russian scientist who was in the government, and then he left to start the company as during the Gorbachev era, and in 1990, I think, and then he eventually moved to Germany, and then he brought the company over to the U.S. And that was where he's and he made the company and came to the U.S. and made $1 billion company out of it.
But early on, Jeff, as you recall, or as I recall from my research, in speaking of solution in search of a problem, Bell Labs, which got very involved in patenting laser technology after a while, early on, told towns that he submitted a paper and thought that it deserved a patent, and they couldn't figure out what it would be used for, so they didn't want to patent it at the time.
Bell Labs almost missed the fiber optics too, and because the low loss fiber was made at Corning Glass Works.
Yeah.
And in this case, the impetus came from England, from a Chinese scientist, Charles Kao, who had immigrated to England, and he made one key thing that I think really made a difference between his approach was he went to some glass scientists and said, "How clear can you make glass? How clear could glass be if you really wanted to make it? Because at that point you didn't need glass to be more than transparent for more than a few feet." And Bell Labs said, what is the clearest glass you can buy? And that's a very different statement, really, because what if nobody had a reason to try to make fibers more clearer and more transparent, they wouldn't bother to sell them. And so Corning Glass, which had already worked on silica, fused silica, which was could be very clear glass, picked up on Kao's idea and went and used the technology they'd already developed to make very clear glass. And they were light years ahead of Bell Labs.
Yeah, again, I keep coming back to this. Clearly there was the main focus of the innovation seemed to be in the American system rather than in some of the foreign places. But I believe you had a similar thing in the invention of the transistor. The physics of semiconductors. The Russian scientists were every bit the par of people like William Shockley, but I would still say that William Shockley had a certain imaginative approach to understanding semiconductor physics. And what I'm wondering was where did that imaginative spark come from for lasers?
Well, in Russia, or at the Soviet era at the time, I mean, how much could people profit from what they invented? Gould, for example, had and the idea he wanted to be like Thomas Edison.
Mm-hmm.
He held his inventions very closely. First of all, he thought he had to build a laser, which was incorrect. He also wore glasses all his life, and he wanted to invent, and did invent, a version of contact lenses that could breathe, and which, if I'm not mistaken, did not exist at the time. He could never bring himself to go to a contact lens company to present his idea to manufacture contact lenses, because he was afraid somebody would steal his idea. That was the problem that he had all along, and it certainly applied, because he didn't learn enough about patent laws to realize that he didn't have to build a laser in order to get a patent on it.
We have a culture that does tend to encourage thinking, and sometimes, the corporations tend to, shut things down and not, to just not get it really, not be able to see that they accept the risk that they have to take on to do some serious work to get it. Now, you take Corning, there were times they slowed things down, but they just had a few people doing it. They had this technology to start with. They knew they had it. They knew their glass very, very well. They really handled that masterfully. Bell Labs almost shut down the guys who were making the long-lived diode lasers, which were absolutely crucial, and I think was one of the biggest contributions Bell Labs made to semiconductors.
Yeah. Amazing. So, you alluded a little very early on in the webinar, Nick, about what you call the 30-year patent war, and you mentioned some of the players that went into that, but for example, Gould, I believe it was, just didn't understand patent law well enough, and so that set up the circumstances for a long legal fight. And I imagine Bell Labs was part of that as well. So what actually drove that 30-year patent war? Was it intellectual possessive over ideas, or was it commercially driven, or
it was on, well, Gould, of course, was a graduate student, a 37-year-old graduate student when he wrote his notebook.
Okay.
Of course, there was Towns and Shallow, and having invented the maser, and actually Towns called lasers early on a maser at optical frequencies.
Okay.
But he and his brother-in-law Shallow got the first patent on what became known as lasers. And so, and Towns was an august scientist. Shallow was a little more approachable in terms of people like researchers like me. But Towns was very, very possessive of his laser patent, and Gould thought that, and was correct. The patent system proved this to be true, that he deserved use patents because he described lasers being used to heat materials and so on and so forth, distance measuring, and optically pumped lasers, which is a light from outside the lasing medium, and oscillators, which is the tube that we talked about where the light bounces back and forth. And he did actually collisions of the second kind, which is, Jeff can probably explain that better than I can, but it's also another way of amplifying lasers. And Gould just believed in himself, and he found enough investors who also believed in him to invest in his patent fight. And company called Patlex was created. Patlex and some big investors put money into Gould's patent fight, hoping that he could then get patents and therefore collect royalties. By the time this all developed over the years, the laser industry was a big industry. The uses were found for lasers were so great and so varied that it became $100 million and plus industry very early on. And so the people who invested in Gould thought that they were investing in future revenues, which was correct. Towns generally oppose this, but the patent office opposed it more. And so over a long period of time, Gould's patents were denied. Patents that he'd been awarded were threatened with being taken away. But he had enough money because of the investors who saw gold at the end of the rainbow that he managed to continue the fight, to the extent that he ended up with 4 basic laser patents. And the length of the fight, the 30 years it took him to get all of these patents, one was issued earlier on, but he still had, I think, several years to go. Patent term 17 years at the time. He had several years to go when he finally got his patents, and the money came pouring in by millions and millions of dollars. Gould had bartered away to keep up the fight all but 20% of his later income. But that 20% amounted to millions and millions of dollars. And he retired or died a rich man because of all this. And who's the fellow who headed the New York Stock Exchange at one point, whose name is escaping me right now, was a big investor. And there were other big investors, some of whom got bought out. But the company that Patlex that owned or that was investing in the Gould fight ultimately owned these patents in the end, and was very aggressive about licensing the laser manufacturers who didn't want. They'd been paying Towns and Shallow on their patent. They didn't want to pay Gould as well. So the search for royalty income was very, very heated. And it took a long time, and a lot of lawyers probably got rich as well.
Yeah, it was, and the laser industry was hopping mad.
Yes, it was.
They were furious, and there were, because this had gone. They figured, we should have gotten the, this paid off the fundamental patents years ago.
Right.
And then wham! So after almost 17, it was about 17 years after the patents were first applied for that the first one got through, and then there were probably another 10 years of fights over those patents.
And not only that, as a result of this, probably primarily as Gould's case, the patent system changed. When Gould was pursuing his patents, it was a matter of who could prove invention first, as opposed to who could prove they filed first. Now it's a question of who filed first. And you can't come back with notebooks and so on and so forth to prove that you were a previous inventor. So the patent system changed as a result of the Gould's patent fight.
One of the issues that one of our associates at National Association of Scholars is working on is just how effective is science in the courtroom. Can it you have witnesses who obviously bring their own biases, but then poor judges have to sort through all this. So what were some of the challenges that the judges who were involved in adjudicating this 30-year patent war had to deal with? One feels sorry for these judges who aren't scientists, but nevertheless have to deal with some pretty sophisticated scientific questions. Did that kind of mismatch play any role in prolonging this patent fight?
Well, it did, because and it was not only the judges, but juries as well.
Oh,
and of course, some lawyers are more effective than others. Gould, Towns testified against Gould, but Gould had the better lawyers. Patlex, the company, had better lawyers. And Gould, because he was an august scientist, and because he was a Nobel Prize winner, always believed that Gould had stolen from him, whereas Gould had taken his notebook, a notebook of his, to Towns and had him sign it, and that came down to an argument in one of the courtroom cases, where the lawyer for Gould and Patlex forced Towns to admit that he had seen Gould's work as opposed to Gould having stolen his work. So, it came down to academic pride versus the prospect of income. That was part of it. And that many of these things were hard to explain to juries and to judges. And in some cases, judges reversed themselves entirely when they were presented with more evidence. There were appeals upon appeals. Judges make wrong decisions. They revisited them. They changed their minds. That's one reason why it took 30 years, and, while the laser industry continued to grow and produce more bounteous royalties than would have existed in the first place.
Yeah. Jeff, what are your thoughts on that?
I suspect it's hard. I was consulted for a couple of lawyers on patents at various times, and I never got, I was sitting in a courtroom once, but I never, got involved with it. But there's a lot of Arcadia, and a lot of it is legal Arcadia, really. Will happen, will happen. And I think the courts are much more attuned to the simple things that are straightforward rules of law. Like you could not patent something if it had been more than a year after it was published in some way. And there was a case in the early history of fiber optics for use in medicine, where a guy in Holland had published a paper in a journal, a Dutch journal, and and the U.S. lawyers who were looking at that paper thought it was because it said 12/6/53 or whatever it was. It meant December 12th.
Okay.
It said December 6th, and it didn't. And with the guy who was trying to patent it, and they had been sitting on patent filings before June, so they had just blown the deadline because they didn't know how the Europeans wrote dates. But that was something they could jump upon because that was a clear matter of law. More than who had invented what. And the esoteric of who had invented what.
And the legal terms like collateral estoppel come to mind. that doesn't mean anything right off the bat, but it means that if you've invented one thing and you're saying you invented something that relates to that, if you didn't invent the first thing, you couldn't have invented the second thing. But Gould was judged not to have invented an amplifier because the laser, the oscillator had already been invented. Finally, one of the judges realized that the laser was in fact two inventions, amplifiers and oscillators, and that got reversed. But this took a long, long time, and for some reason, and nobody, certainly I never figured out quite why, the patent office seemed determined to deny Gould any patent whatsoever. But that ultimately changed in the end, and of course he did win 4, as I say, basic laser patents.
That was interesting. Sometimes you find that there are connections that probably are not completely proper, where somebody, Bell Labs may have had ways of leaning on people who were in the patent office. Yeah. Bell Labs was really very much in Towns's
exactly right.
side.
Yeah.
And there was in fact, I stumbled upon something about how the patent, the proposal that Gould made to DARPA ended up being classified because it came down to more or less a hissy fit between a Bell Labs manager and a manager at DARPA, and DARPA's Bell Labs said, we won't, we should have this, and the DARPA manager said no, and Bell Labs said, well, we'll get it over your dead body, more or less, and the DARPA guy classified it.
And DARPA, we should say, stands for Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which is the agency that funded the $1 million TRG contract.
Yeah, so it can boil down to those kinds of strange personality quirks as well. That's interesting. So I see we have a couple of questions in the Q&A. Again, I encourage people to put their questions into the Q&A, but why don't we go to the Q&A and start to have a look at those. And usually the answers generate as much questions in the Q&A as the original questions do. So let's just have a look at some of the Q&As that are in so far. So Jack Wasserman gives the first question. What are the military uses of lasers, as in Israel, and what types, and how are they used?
Well, I wrote a book called Lasers, Death Rays, and the long, strange quest for the ultimate weapon.
Yeah.
And there's really a lot of applications. The two primary ones at the there's such a long history. I can think of DARPA was back in 1959, 1960 was very worried about missile defense because they were worried about Soviet nuclear missiles, and the money that went to DARPA to TRG was part of this missile defense program that they wanted, because they thought, and Gould had talked about being able to shoot, to produce high powers. So DARPA thought this was, shooting down missile defense, and it was lasers were part of Star Wars, the Reagan Star Wars. And now the Israeli part of it is that the technology has come to such a point that it is possible to shoot down missiles if they're within a couple of miles of the laser. It's not easy, but it can be done, and that's that's why it's interesting to Israel because they have a particular set of problems that
Yes.
with short distances. And there's also the other use of lasers has been with laser dazzlers, which you use very bright visible lasers so that they essentially flash blind you if you try to look at them.
Yeah.
That's used to deter piracy at the high seas. The pirates come up, you shine the laser at them, and
Yeah.
Good idea.
Yeah. I'm sure that the military applications aren't just for destroying things as well. I'm sure there's a million different kinds of military uses of these, as they have been in civilian uses as well.
Right, yeah. Maiman was developed laser rangefinders very early on.
Yeah. Okay, perhaps Jack can fill in some elaborations on this question, because I'm sure there's a lot to explore there. Greg McNiff asks, relative to Gould's time, is the ecosystem of universities, the military, and the private sector stronger or weaker today? Asked another way, could the laser have been invented today? He said invested, but I think he meant invented there. And this whole issue of science ecosystems is an interesting one. You have scientists working in obviously all kinds of different fields. You have legitimate scientific interests in government and in industry, and also in academia. And one of the things that's happened, and since the end of the war, was an enormous increase in investment of money into the sciences. Some of it funny money, I suppose, but and what that's done is it's profoundly reshaped the science ecosystem, so that you have these different motivations. Academic scientists want academic freedom, complete freedom to go wherever the data lead. And then obviously in the government science, it's for regulation and for support of government functions. And of course, in industry, it's to make money and get market share. And those have kind of tended to merge and mingle the really very different interests that scientists working in those areas have done. And my reading of the history of this is that the overlap was much less back in the time that a lot of these innovations were being made. The original laser innovations that you were discussing, the semiconductor physics around Shockley's time, and those kinds of things. And so, this is a thing that interests me a lot. Do you think that the ecosystem of science has changed in a way that it's getting in the way of innovation?
It's an interesting question, and you have to remember that when at the time of the laser's invention, the anti-communism was such a big thing that cut out certainly the work that somebody like Gould was doing. And as we've said, thinking that the laser was a problem in search of a solution, or a solution in search of a problem, that didn't attract manufacturers to invest money in research in the same way that they would with a more obviously commercial invention, although obviously it's commercial now. So I don't really know how, certainly corporations would be inclined to invest in research on the university level, and university researchers are, of course, I don't know to what extent they're inclined or necessarily give their patents to the institutions that they work for. So it's a good question, but I certainly don't have a clue.
Yeah, it's complex, and I think part of the factor too is the entrepreneurial factor. I've seen a lot of people, scientists in the research field hop off into, their cutting edge ideas, hop off right into startups.
Yeah.
And some of them work and some of them don't. And then there's a lot of, gaming around investment. And, you'll hear some people who are very bitter about their experiences with their startups because they were pushed out by the investors.
Yeah. 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 Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the solution is, and again, I just keep bringing up Shockley, not only because I think the transistor along with the laser was one of the profoundly transformative inventions in the 20th century, but also, if you looked at Shockley's career, for example, and certainly it seems to be the case with Maiman and Gould and Towns, that they tended to move naturally between industry and academia. And Shockley was with Bell Labs for many years. He started his own company, which was ended up being a failure. He was at Stanford engineering for a long time. And if you look at his invention, he seemed to have a lot more intellectual freedom than someone who's kind of stuck in an academic tenure level position, and not in as great a position to innovate. And I know universities, they try to encourage patents and patenting, and they don't do a particularly good job actually of turning them into usable products. But again, it seems like the role of academic sciences has been a little commingled with things that maybe shouldn't be happening in academia. If you have a great idea, go start a company or go work for the government or something like that. And so
it's a hard thing, and
yeah.
I have to drop what comes to my mind first is that the invention of the hollow core fiber, which is actually turns out to have been come out of the University of Southampton in England. And that which has in turn, I think it led to a startup, and I'm not sure, I think they may have been, I'm trying to remember if they have been or not. They may have been bought by some larger company, but this is, but what it was a tremendous amount of burst of innovation. It's not quite yet clear where in the business economy that's going to come and whether that's going to be a major invention or not.
Yeah.
But it sometimes seems to be people. It sometimes happens to be someone in the right place at the right time. And there are certainly, one of the things that I think has been a transition is that the big laboratories that were so central in the 1950s and 1960s have largely fallen apart. I mean, Bell Labs,
yeah. But of course, you see universities pursuing this kind of hybrid business model avidly, with incubators and these kinds of things. And again, most of those companies don't really succeed, right?
You don't expect most companies to succeed.
Yeah.
I mean, this is that's the way it works. Most companies don't last 5 or 10 years. I was involved with a magazine startup, and it lasted about 10 years.
Okay.
Years.
Yeah.
And
okay.
That was longer than average.
Yeah. The creative destruction of the marketplace, right? So, all right. Well, we're reaching the end of our time here. I'd like to thank both of you for a fascinating discussion, and let me just wrap up with any thoughts that you guys have about today's topic.
Well, I would say just that it's when I wrote this book, and it was published in 2000. By then, the laser industry was well developed, but as Jeff well knows, it continues to be even more well developed, and new uses keep being found all the time. I'm certainly, for my part, I'm just glad to have known Gordon Gould and to have met Charles Towns and Arthur Shallow,
Yeah.
simply because they were such great minds about something that has become so ubiquitous that we can't imagine the world without it. And, it's just a pleasure to have been able to tell this story.
Yeah, that's great.
It's been, I mean, having been, immersed in that little world for, well, close to 50 years now. It's, it's been like going in a highly successful team in major big league sports. It's amazing. And I think it's also interesting that I've started looking at now, if you look at when lasers and optics, were back around 1950, it was sort of just an old over the hill, old and over the hill. And I talked with somebody who had been in the optics education, and his professor said, go out of it, go into solid state physics. And he became one of the group that started Fairchild Semiconductor. And, so he went from tired old optics into semiconductors. But what you've seen with optics now is that with the invention of the laser and the invention of fiber optics, that's been a breakthrough. And that, now lasers, the whole field of optics is a dynamic field.
Yeah.
So you need some breakthroughs some breakthroughs that will let you expand, like the many different types of lasers that I was talking about.
Yeah.
And that can be tremendous.
Yes. Well, thank you, Nick, and thank you, Jeff, for your contributions. Before we sign out, let me just mention to the people who are listening, if you're not a member of the National Association of Scholars, please do join us, because we're doing a lot of good work, I think, there, among them this webinar and the things that you shared with us today, Nick and Jeff. And just to put in another personal plug, if any of you are scientists who are watching and would like to see some of the things the NAS is doing in the sciences, we'll have a booth at the AAAS meetings in March, and by all means, stop in and say hello, friendly or not, and we'll look forward to seeing you there. So with that, I will bid you all good day. Thanks, Nick, and thanks, Jeff, for a wonderful discussion.
Thank you,
Okay.
Scott.
All right.